I still remember the silence that followed Mr. Henderson's words, how the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick louder than my own heartbeat. $20 million to my sister Rachel. The family business, the properties, the investment portfolio, everything that represented 3 generations of the Walsh family legacy, all handed to her on a silver platter. And me? I got $1,000 and a letter that said, "For your understanding." That's when I stood up in that oak-paneled office, my voice cutting through the stunned quiet like a blade, and said the 4 words that changed everything. Check the will again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Walsh, and up until 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was in my family. I was the responsible one, the daughter who stayed close to home in Portland, Oregon, who helped run Walsh Construction from the ground up, while my older sister Rachel chased her dreams in New York City. I was the one who spent every weekend at our parents' house, who took care of Mom during her chemotherapy treatments, who held Dad's hand during his heart surgery recovery. I was 31 years old, unmarried by choice, and completely devoted to the family business that had been my grandfather's pride and joy since 1952. Rachel, on the other hand, was the golden child who could do no wrong. 2 years older than me, she had always been the star of every room she entered. Tall, blonde, with that effortless charm that made people instantly like her. She had moved to Manhattan right after college to pursue what she called bigger opportunities. She worked in marketing for some tech startup, lived in a trendy apartment in Brooklyn, and visited home maybe twice a year, usually around Christmas and Dad's birthday. Every time she came back, it was like watching our parents light up from the inside. Mom would spend weeks preparing her favorite meals, and Dad would cancel meetings just to spend time with his little princess. I tried not to be bitter about it. Really, I did. I told myself that every family has different dynamics, that parents don't always mean to play favorites, that love isn't a competition. But when you're the daughter who sacrifices her social life to drive your mother to chemotherapy appointments, while your sister sends flowers from across the country, it's hard not to feel the sting of inequality. Walsh Construction had been my world since I graduated from Portland State with a degree in business management. I started in the office doing administrative work, but Dad quickly realized I had a head for numbers and a genuine understanding of the construction industry. Within 5 years, I was handling contract negotiations, managing project timelines, and overseeing our crew of 43 employees. I knew every client by name, understood every aspect of our supply chain, and could walk onto any job site and immediately spot potential problems. Dad used to say I had the Walsh eye for quality, the same instinct that had made my grandfather successful back when he started the company with nothing but a pickup truck and a toolbox. When potential clients called, they asked for me specifically. When our biggest competitors tried to poach our workers, the crew stayed loyal because they trusted my leadership. I wasn't just working at Walsh Construction, I was Walsh Construction in every way that mattered except for the name on the legal documents. Mom and Dad seemed to understand this. During family dinners, Dad would talk about when Emma takes over the business, and Mom would beam with pride when neighbors complimented them on my work. They attended every award ceremony when the company won recognition, every Chamber of Commerce event where I represented our family legacy. I thought I was building something permanent, something that would carry the Walsh name into the next generation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was in the office early, reviewing blueprints for a new residential development project, when I noticed Dad's handwriting on a document I'd never seen before. It was tucked into a folder marked Personal, Private, which had been accidentally mixed in with the project files. The document was titled Estate Planning Review and dated just 6 months earlier. I shouldn't have looked. I knew it was wrong the moment I unfolded the paper. But something about seeing my name written in Dad's careful script made me pause. The document was just notes, not a legal will, but it outlined his thoughts about, quote, distributing assets fairly between both daughters. What struck me was a line near the bottom that read, Emma's contributions to family business. Financial compensation versus ownership transfer. Discuss with Henderson. Henderson was our family lawyer, the same man who had handled Dad's business contracts for over 20 years. The fact that Dad was discussing financial compensation versus ownership transfer seemed odd. If I was going to inherit the business, why would there be a question about compensation instead of ownership? I folded the paper back exactly as I'd found it and tried to push the nagging worry out of my mind. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other small things. Dad took phone calls in his study with the door closed, something he'd never done before. Mom seemed distracted during our usual Saturday morning coffee dates, like she was keeping a secret that was eating at her. When I asked direct questions about the future of the company, Dad would give vague answers about, quote, making sure everyone is taken care of, and, quote, complex family considerations. The strangest incident happened on a Thursday evening when I stopped by their house to drop off some contracts for Dad to review. I let myself in through the kitchen door, as I had done thousands of times before, and heard voices coming from the living room. Dad was on the phone, and I caught fragments of his conversation as I hung my jacket in the hallway. "I know it seems unfair," he was saying, "but Emma will understand. She's always been practical about these things. And $20,000 should be enough to help her get started somewhere else." $20,000. My stomach dropped. I stood frozen in the hallway, straining to hear more. But Dad's voice became quieter. When he hung up the phone, I made noise in the kitchen, rattling dishes and calling out so he'd know I was there. He appeared in the doorway with a smile that seemed forced, asking about my day as if nothing had happened. That night, I barely slept. $20,000 was a generous gift by most standards, but for someone who had spent 7 years building a company worth millions, it felt like a slap in the face. I tried to convince myself that I had misheard, that Dad was talking about something else entirely, but the worry gnawed at me like a splinter I couldn't remove. The call came on a rainy Friday morning in early April. Dad had suffered a massive heart attack while working in the garden. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. He was 63 years old, still strong and vital, with plans to travel with Mom once they officially retired from the business. His death was sudden, shocking, and completely devastating. Mom was inconsolable. I took leave from running the company to stay with her, handling funeral arrangements, managing the endless stream of visitors, and trying to keep our family business running while processing my own grief. Rachel flew in from New York the day before the funeral, and for a brief time, it felt like we were united in our shared loss. She held Mom while she cried, helped organize Dad's belongings, and even spent a few hours at the office learning about the business operations she had never shown interest in before. During those first weeks after Dad's death, the question of inheritance felt inappropriate and selfish. I was focused on helping Mom adjust to life without her partner of 35 years, and ensuring that our employees felt secure about the future of Uniton, the company. Our clients expressed condolences and confidence that Walsh Construction would continue to honor the standards Dad had established. Everyone seemed to assume that I would naturally step into his role as owner and president. It was Mom who first mentioned the will reading, about 3 weeks after the funeral. She was sorting through Dad's papers in his study when she found a note reminding him to update estate documents with Henderson priority. She called Mr. Henderson's office that afternoon, and we scheduled an appointment for the following Monday. Rachel decided to extend her stay in Portland to attend the reading, which seemed natural since she was named in Dad's will as well. I felt nervous driving to Henderson's law office that Monday morning, but it was the kind of nervousness you might feel before a job interview or an important presentation. I expected there might be some complicated tax considerations or legal formalities to navigate, but I assumed the basic outline would be straightforward. Mom would inherit the house and Dad's personal assets, I would inherit the business, and Rachel would receive some financial gift that acknowledged her place in the family. Henderson's office was located in a restored Victorian building in downtown Portland, with creaky wooden floors and tall windows that overlooked the Willamette River. The conference room where we gathered was decorated with dark wood paneling and leather-bound legal books that gave it the feeling of old-world authority. Mom sat in the chair closest to Henderson's desk, looking fragile in her black dress and pearl necklace. Rachel sat across from me, checking her phone intermittently and seeming slightly impatient with the formal atmosphere. Henderson was a tall, thin man in his 60s, who had known our family since before I was born. He offered his condolences again, spoke briefly about Dad's character and integrity, and then opened the thick folder that contained Dad's final will and testament. The document was dated just 4 months before Dad's death, much more recent than I had expected. He began reading in that formal, legal tone that lawyers use for important documents. The initial sections covered standard language about debts and taxes, the appointment of Henderson himself as executor, and specific gifts to various charities that Dad had supported over the years. Mom inherited the family home, Dad's personal belongings, and a life insurance policy that would ensure her financial security for the rest of her life. Then Henderson reached the section about Walsh Construction, and my heart started beating faster with anticipation. This was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for my entire adult life. The official recognition of all the work I had put into building Dad's legacy. To my daughter Rachel Elizabeth Walsh, Henderson read, his voice steady and clear. I leave the entirety of Walsh Construction Company, including all business assets, property holdings, equipment, and investment accounts associated with the company operations. The current estimated value of these assets is approximately $20 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs, and for a moment, the room seemed to spin slightly. Rachel looked up from her phone with surprise, her mouth falling open as she processed what she had just heard. Mom's hands flew to her throat, and she made a small gasping sound. Henderson continued reading without pause. To my daughter Emma Catherine Walsh, I leave the sum of $1,000 and this letter, with gratitude for her understanding and my hope that this distribution will allow both of my daughters to pursue their own paths in life. $1,000. After 7 years of 60-hour work weeks, after sacrificing potential relationships and personal goals, after becoming the heart and soul of Walsh Construction, I was worth $1,000 in my father's eyes. Rachel, who hadn't set foot in our office more than a dozen times in her entire life, inherited everything I had helped build. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, the tick of Henderson's antique clock, and the distant sound of traffic outside the windows. Rachel was staring at Henderson like he had just spoken in a foreign language. Mom was looking back and forth between Rachel and me, confusion and distress written across her face. That's when something inside me snapped into focus. This wasn't just unfair, it was impossible. The man who had told me I had the Walsh eye for quality, who had talked about me taking over the business, who had trusted me with every important decision for the past 3 years, would never have made this choice. Not the father who had watched me cry over failed relationships because I was too committed to the family business to make time for dating. Not the man who had told clients that his daughter Emma was the future of Walsh Construction. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. Henderson looked at me with sympathy, probably assuming I needed a moment to process the shock of being essentially disinherited. Rachel was still staring at the will document, and Mom had tears streaming down her face. But I wasn't overwhelmed with grief or shock. I was angry, and more than that, I was certain that something was fundamentally wrong with what we had just heard. "Check the will again," I said, my voice cutting through the silence with more authority than I felt. Henderson looked up at me with surprise. "I'm sorry, Emma. I know this must be difficult to understand, but I can assure you that this document is authentic and legally binding. Your father signed it in my presence, with 2 witnesses, just 4 months ago." I remained standing, my hands gripping the back of my chair. "Mr. Henderson, with all due respect, I need you to check that will again, because the man you just described is not my father." Something in my tone must have conveyed the seriousness of my request, because Henderson's expression shifted from sympathy to professional concern. He looked down at the document again, then back up at me. Emma, I understand that you're upset, but… I'm not upset, I interrupted, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. I'm telling you that there is something wrong with that document. My father would never have left the family business to someone who doesn't know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition. He would never have given everything we built together to someone who has been to our office maybe 12 times in 7 years. Rachel finally found her voice. Emma, I know this is a shock, but maybe Dad thought… Don't, I said, holding up my hand. Just don't. Rachel, you don't even know the names of our employees. You couldn't identify half of our regular clients if they walked through that door. You have never shown any interest in construction, in the business, or in carrying on Dad's legacy. So please don't try to explain to me why he would suddenly decide to leave you everything. I turned back to Henderson, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Henderson, I'm not questioning your legal expertise or your integrity, but I am asking you to look at that will again, because something is not right. This distribution makes no sense based on our family dynamics, our business relationships, or anything my father ever said about his intentions for the company. Henderson glanced at Mom, who was still sitting in stunned silence, then back at me. Emma, I reviewed this will carefully when your father signed it. I asked him specifically if he was certain about these distributions, and he confirmed that this was his intention. Then I need to see the previous version, I said firmly, because I know for a fact that Dad updated his will multiple times over the years. I want to see what it said before this version. For the first time since he had started reading, Henderson hesitated. He looked down at the folder in front of him, then closed it carefully. That would be highly unusual, he said slowly. The current will supersedes all previous versions, and there's really no legal reason to… I'm not asking for legal reasons, I said, my voice growing still stronger. I'm asking because I have spent 7 years of my life building that company with my father, and the will you just read describes a man I have never met. So either my father had a complete personality change in the last 4 months of his life, or there is something about this situation that we need to understand better. The room fell silent again. Rachel was looking between Henderson and me like she was watching a tennis match. Mom had stopped crying and was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, Henderson opened the folder again and pulled out a different document. This one was older, the paper slightly yellowed, and stapled together with an older style of staple that suggested it had been prepared years earlier. This is your father's previous will, he said reluctantly. It was prepared 3 years ago, and as I said, it has been superseded by the more recent document. He opened the older will and scanned down to the relevant section. As he read silently, his expression changed subtly, a small frown appearing between his eyebrows. What does it say? I asked, my heart pounding. Henderson looked up at me, then at Rachel, then back down at the document. According to the previous will, Walsh Construction was to be left entirely to you, Emma. Rachel was to receive a financial gift of $50,000, and your mother was to inherit the family home and personal assets. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of shock, it was the silence of a truth that had been hiding just beneath the surface. Rachel stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. I don't understand. Why would he change it? I never asked him to change it. I never even knew I was inheriting anything until today. I stared at Henderson, my mind racing. So in 3 years, Dad went from leaving me the family business to leaving me $1,000, and a note about understanding. What happened in those 3 years that could possibly explain such a dramatic change? Henderson was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with something. Finally, he set both documents side by side on his desk. Emma, I want you to know that when your father came to me 4 months ago to update his will, I questioned him extensively about this change. It was such a departure from his previous intentions that I felt obligated to make sure he understood the implications. And what did he say? He said that circumstances had changed, that he had learned information that affected his decision about the business succession, but he wouldn't elaborate on what that information was. He seemed troubled, I would say, not like himself. Mom spoke for the first time since the reading had begun, her voice barely above a whisper. Troubled how? Henderson turned to her with obvious sympathy. Margaret, your husband seemed to be under a great deal of stress when he came to see me. He mentioned that he had discovered something that changed his perspective on the family business, but he insisted that he couldn't discuss the details. He asked me to prepare the new will immediately, which was unusual for him. Normally, Robert liked to take time with important decisions. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Mr. Henderson, do you still have Dad's notes from that meeting? Anything that might explain what he meant by changed circumstances? Henderson hesitated again, then opened his desk drawer and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. He flipped through several pages before stopping at one covered with his careful handwriting. I take notes during all my client meetings, he said. Let me see. Yes, here it is. Your father said, and I quote, I've learned something about the business that changes everything. Emma cannot inherit Walsh Construction. It would be unfair to her and potentially dangerous. Rachel is the only choice now. Dangerous. The word hung in the air like smoke. I looked at Rachel, who had gone pale, then at Mom, who was staring at Henderson with growing alarm. Dangerous, how? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He wouldn't say. But Emma, there's something else? Henderson flipped to another page in his notebook. Your father also asked me about the legal process for dissolving a business partnership. He wanted to know what would happen if one partner discovered that the other partner had been engaged in illegal activities. The room started to feel smaller, like the walls were closing in. Walsh Construction had never had any business partners. Dad had always been the sole owner, just as his father had been before him. Unless… Mr. Henderson, I said slowly, who else has signature authority on the Walsh Construction business accounts? He looked confused by the question. Well, your father, of course. And you, as the office manager. Those are the only two names on the accounts, as far as I know. But that wasn't right. I was the office manager, but I had never been given signature authority on the main business accounts. I handled petty cash and some operational expenses, but Dad had always maintained control over the major financial decisions. I had assumed it was just his way of keeping oversight of the business, a normal precaution for a company owner. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said carefully. I don't have signature authority on any of the major accounts. Dad never gave me that level of access. Henderson's frown deepened. He reached for another folder and pulled out a set of bank documents. According to the paperwork I have here, you were added as a co-signer on all Walsh Construction accounts 18 months ago. Your father brought these documents to me to notarize your signature. He handed me the papers, and I stared down at them in confusion. There was my signature, clear as day, on documents that gave me full access to every Walsh Construction bank account, credit line, and investment fund. But I had never signed these papers. I had never even seen them before. This isn't possible, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I never signed these documents. Rachel leaned over to look at the papers. Emma, that's definitely your signature. I've seen you sign things 1,000 times. She was right. The signature was perfect, every loop and line exactly the way I wrote my name. But I had absolutely no memory of signing these documents, and I was certain I had never been to Henderson's office for this purpose. Mom reached for the papers with trembling hands. She studied the signature for a long moment, then looked up at me with an expression that was half confusion and half fear. Emma, she said quietly, if you didn't sign these papers, then who did? That's when the truth began to dawn on me, slowly and horribly, like watching a car accident happen in slow motion. Someone had forged my signature to gain access to the Walsh Construction accounts. Someone who knew my signature well enough to replicate it perfectly. Someone who had access to the business and the opportunity to carry out financial transactions without Dad's knowledge. But more importantly, someone who Dad had discovered. Someone whose illegal activities had prompted him to ask Henderson about dissolving business partnerships and changing his will to protect me from something, quote, dangerous. I thought about all those times over the past 18 months, when Dad had seemed stressed about money, when he had mentioned unexpected expenses or delayed payments from clients. I thought about the new locks he had installed on his office door, the way he had started keeping certain files in a safe at home instead of at the office. And I thought about the one person who had been pressuring Dad to give them more involvement in the family business, who had complained about being left out of the Walsh legacy, who had made several trips home from New York over the past 2 years to discuss financial planning with our parents. "Rachel?" I said, my voice steady despite the storm of realization building inside me. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." She looked up at me with those wide blue eyes that had always been able to convince our parents of anything. "What? Have you ever signed my name on any documents related to Walsh Construction?" The question hung between us, like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross. Rachel's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked almost like relief. "Emma," she said quietly, "I think we need to talk." Rachel's admission came in pieces, like watching someone slowly peel away layers of carefully constructed lies. She didn't confess everything at once. Instead, she sat back down in her chair, folded her hands in her lap like she was preparing for a difficult conversation, and began to speak in a voice so quiet that Henderson had to lean forward to hear her. "It started about 2 years ago," she said, not meeting anyone's eyes. "I was having financial problems in New York. The startup I was working for went under, and I had been living beyond my means for months, thinking the company would eventually get more funding. When they folded, I was left with nothing. No job, no savings, and about $40,000 in credit card debt." Mom made a soft sound of distress, but Rachel continued without looking at her. "I came home for Dad's birthday that year, remember? I was planning to ask him for a loan, but when I saw how well the business was doing, how much money was flowing through those accounts that Emma managed every day, I started thinking there had to be another way." I felt sick listening to her, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I needed to hear all of it before I could figure out what to do next. I knew Emma's signature because I had been forging it since we were kids. Remember how I used to sign her name on permission slips when she forgot them? And on birthday cards to boyfriends she was too shy to sign herself? I was always good at copying handwriting. The casual way she mentioned this, like it was a harmless childhood prank rather than the foundation for financial fraud, made my hands clench into fists under the conference table. The first time was just supposed to be temporary. I was home for Christmas, and Emma was sick with the flu, so she asked me to help her with some paperwork at the office. While I was there, I saw how easy it would be to transfer money between accounts. Emma had told me how Dad trusted her completely, how he rarely double-checked the financial transactions she handled. Henderson was taking notes, his pen moving rapidly across his legal pad. Mom was staring at Rachel like she was seeing her for the first time. So I transferred $15,000 from the main operating account to a smaller account that Emma used for office supplies and miscellaneous expenses. Then I wrote myself a check from that account for, quote, consulting services. I told myself I would pay it back as soon as I found another job. "But you didn't find another job," I said, my voice coming out harder than I intended. Rachel shook her head. "I found another job, but it didn't pay nearly enough to cover my debts and my living expenses, so I came home again a few months later and took another $10,000. Then another $8,000 after that. Each time, I told myself it was the last time, that I would figure out a way to pay it back." "How much?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Over the past 2 years?" Rachel's voice was barely audible. "About $230,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $230,000. That was more than many people made in 5 years. That was enough money to buy a house, to start a business, to completely change someone's life. And she had stolen it from our family business by forging my signature and exploiting Dad's trust in me." Henderson stopped writing and looked up at Rachel with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who had just confessed to murder. "Rachel," he said slowly, "you do understand that what you're describing is felony fraud? Multiple felonies, actually. Forgery, embezzlement, wire fraud if you transferred money electronically across state lines." "I know," she whispered. "I know what I did was wrong. But I never meant for it to hurt anyone. I thought the business was doing so well that no one would even notice. But Dad did notice, I said, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. That's why he was stressed about money. That's why he started keeping files in a safe at home. He figured out what was happening. Rachel nodded miserably. About 6 months ago, he called me and asked me to come home immediately. He said he had discovered some irregularities in the business accounts and needed to discuss them with me in person. I knew I was caught. What did you tell him? I told him everything. About the debt, about the transfers, about forging Emma's signature. I begged him not to involve the police. I promised I would pay everything back, but I needed time. Mom finally found her voice. Rachel, honey, why didn't you just ask us for help? We would have found a way to help you with your debts. We're your family. Because I was ashamed, Rachel said, tears finally starting to fall. Because I was supposed to be the successful one, the daughter who made it in the big city. How could I come home and admit that I was a complete failure? That I had been pretending to have this glamorous life while I was actually drowning in debt? I thought about all those times Rachel had come home with expensive clothes and designer handbags, talking about her exciting life in New York, posting photos on social media that made her life look perfect. All of it had been funded by money stolen from our family business. So Dad agreed not to call the police, I said, working through the timeline in my mind. But he changed his will to make sure you inherited the business instead of me. He said it was the only way to protect you, Rachel said, looking at me directly for the first time since she had started confessing. He said that if you inherited a business that had been the victim of embezzlement, you would be legally responsible for the missing money. The IRS would hold you accountable for the tax implications, and if any clients or employees found out about the fraud, they could sue you personally. But if I inherited the business, she continued, I would be inheriting my own crime. Dad said that way, the legal responsibility would fall on me, not you. He said it was the only way to make sure you didn't pay for my mistakes. The twisted logic of it was almost impressive. Dad had changed his will not to punish me but to protect me. He had given everything to Rachel because she was the one who had committed the crimes, and he wanted to make sure that the legal and financial consequences fell on her shoulders rather than mine. But why didn't he just tell me what was happening? I asked, feeling a mix of anger and grief that was almost overwhelming. Why didn't he give me the choice to decide how to handle it? Because he knew you would try to fix it, Mom said quietly, speaking for the first time in several minutes. He knew you would blame yourself for not catching it sooner, and he knew you would want to find a way to protect Rachel from the consequences of her actions. She was right, and I hated that she was right. If Dad had told me what Rachel had done, I would have immediately started trying to figure out how to pay back the money, how to keep it quiet, how to protect our family from scandal. I would have sacrificed my own financial future to clean up Rachel's mess, just like I had sacrificed my social life and my personal relationships to build up the family business. So the letter, I said, remembering the envelope Henderson had mentioned. What does Dad's letter say? Henderson reached into the folder and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Dad's handwriting. He handed it to me, and I opened it with trembling fingers. The letter was 2 pages long, written in the careful script that Dad used for important documents. As I read it, I could hear his voice in my head, calm and measured, explaining his decision with the same thoughtful approach he had always used for difficult conversations. My dear Emma, the letter began, if you are reading this, then you have learned about Rachel's financial difficulties and the mistakes she made with the business accounts. I want you to know that none of this is your fault, and I hope you will understand why I felt I had to make this difficult decision about the inheritance. The letter went on to explain exactly what Rachel had just told us, but from Dad's perspective. He had discovered the missing money during a routine audit he had decided to conduct before updating the business insurance policies. At first, he had thought it was a bookkeeping error, or a problem with the bank's records. But when he dug deeper, he found the pattern of transfers and withdrawals that all traced back to forged signatures and falsified documents. I was faced with an impossible choice, Dad's letter continued. I could report Rachel's actions to the authorities and watch my daughter go to prison, Or I could find another way to handle the situation that would protect both of my daughters from the worst consequences of her mistakes. He had spent weeks consulting with lawyers and accountants, trying to find a solution that would minimize the damage to everyone involved. The conclusion he reached was that the cleanest way to handle the situation was to change his will so that Rachel inherited a business that was already compromised by her own actions. This way, the letter explained, Rachel will be responsible for repaying the money she took, and you will be free to start fresh without inheriting the legal complications of her embezzlement. The $1,000 I am leaving you is not meant to represent your value to me or to our family. It is simply a token that establishes you as a beneficiary while keeping you legally separate from the business assets. The final paragraph of the letter was the hardest to read. Emma, you have been the heart and soul of Walsh Construction since the day you started working with me. You have honor, integrity, and a natural talent for leadership that would have made your grandfather proud. I know that losing the family business will feel like losing a part of yourself, but I believe you have the strength and ability to build something even better on your own. I am changing my will not because I love you less, but because I love you enough to protect you from paying for someone else's mistakes. By the time I finished reading, I was crying harder than I had cried since Dad's funeral. The letter was signed, "With all my love and absolute faith in your future Dad." I set the letter down on the conference table and looked around the room. Henderson was sitting quietly, giving me space to process what I had learned. Mom was crying silently, her hands pressed to her mouth. And Rachel was staring at me with an expression that was equal parts guilt and hope, like she was waiting for me to tell her whether I could ever forgive her. "Rachel," I said finally, my voice hoarse from crying, "I need to ask you something else." She nodded, bracing herself. "The money you took. What did you actually spend it on?" For a moment, she looked like she might lie again, but then her shoulders sagged in defeat. "Some of it went to paying off credit cards and student loans. Maybe $60,000 for actual debts. The rest..." She paused, looking ashamed. "The rest I spent trying to maintain the lifestyle I thought I needed to have in New York. Expensive restaurants, designer clothes, a luxury apartment I couldn't afford. I told myself I needed to look successful to be successful, but really I was just trying to impress people who didn't actually care about me." So Rachel had stolen nearly $250,000 from our family business to fund a fake lifestyle that was designed to impress strangers. The waste of it, the sheer pointlessness of it, was almost more infuriating than the theft itself. "And now?" I asked. "What's your plan now that you've inherited a business with $230,000 missing from its accounts?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I never expected Dad to actually leave me the business. I thought maybe he would leave me enough money to pay back what I had taken, but If you are reading this, then you have learned about Rachel's financial difficulties and the mistakes she made with the business accounts. I want you to know that none of this is your fault, and I hope you will understand why I felt I had to make this difficult decision about the inheritance." The letter went on to explain exactly what Rachel had just told us, but from Dad's perspective. He had discovered the missing money during a routine audit he had decided to conduct before updating the business insurance policies. At first, he had thought it was a bookkeeping error or a problem with the bank's records. But when he dug deeper, he found the pattern of transfers and withdrawals that all traced back to forged signatures and falsified documents. "I was faced with an impossible choice," Dad's letter continued. "I could report Rachel's actions to the authorities and watch my daughter go to prison, or I could find another way to handle the situation that would protect both of my daughters from the worst consequences of her mistakes." He had spent weeks consulting with lawyers and accountants, trying to find a solution that would minimize the damage to everyone involved. The conclusion he reached was that the cleanest way to handle the situation was to change his will so that Rachel inherited a business that was already compromised by her own actions. This way, the letter explained, Rachel will be responsible for repaying the money she took, and you will be free to start fresh without inheriting the legal complications of her embezzlement. The $1,000 I am leaving you is not meant to represent your value to me or to our family. It is simply a token that establishes you as a beneficiary while keeping you legally separate from the business assets. The final paragraph of the letter was the hardest to read. Emma, you have been the heart and soul of Walsh Construction since the day you started working with me. You have honor, integrity, and a natural talent for leadership that would have made your grandfather proud. I know that losing the family business will feel like losing a part of yourself, but I believe you have the strength and ability to build something even better on your own. I am changing my will not because I love you less, but because I love you enough to protect you from paying for someone else's mistakes. By the time I finished reading, I was crying harder than I had cried since Dad's funeral. The letter was signed, "With all my love and absolute faith in your future, Dad." I set the letter down on the conference table and looked around the room. Henderson was sitting quietly, giving me space to process what I had learned. Mom was crying silently, her hands pressed to her mouth. And Rachel was staring at me with an expression that was equal parts guilt and hope, like she was waiting for me to tell her whether I could ever forgive her. "Rachel," I said finally, my voice hoarse from crying, "I need to ask you something else." She nodded, bracing herself. "The money you took, what did you actually spend it on?" For a moment, she looked like she might lie again, but then her shoulders sagged in defeat. "Some of it went to paying off credit cards and student loans. Maybe $60,000 for actual debts. The rest—" She paused, looking ashamed. "The rest I spent trying to maintain the lifestyle I thought I needed to have in New York. Expensive restaurants, designer clothes, a luxury apartment I couldn't afford. I told myself I needed to look successful to be successful, but really I was just trying to impress people who didn't actually care about me." So Rachel had stolen nearly $250,000 from our family business to fund a fake lifestyle that was designed to impress strangers. The waste of it, the sheer pointlessness of it, was almost more infuriating than the theft itself. "And now?" I asked. "What's your plan now that you've inherited a business with $230,000 missing from its accounts?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I never expected Dad to actually leave me the business. I thought maybe he would leave me enough money to pay back what I had taken, but I thought about Dad's letter, about his faith in my ability to build something even better than what we had before. I thought about our employees, who had worked loyally for our family for years and didn't deserve to lose their jobs because of Rachel's selfishness. And I thought about the little girl who used to follow Grandpa around construction sites, dreaming of the day when she would carry on the Walsh family tradition. "I'm sure," I said, "but I have conditions." Rachel looked up at me with cautious hope. "First, you move back to Portland immediately. No more pretending to have a life in New York that you can't afford. Second, you get a job, any job, and start making payments toward the money you stole. I don't care if it takes you 20 years, you're going to pay back every penny." "Okay," she said quickly, "I can do that." Third, you get counseling. Real counseling to figure out why you thought stealing from your family was an acceptable solution to your problems. And fourth, you stay out of the business completely. You don't get to have any input on how Walsh Construction operates, and you don't get to benefit from any of its success." Rachel nodded eagerly. "Whatever you want, Emma. I just want a chance to make this right." I turned to Henderson. "How do we make this happen legally?" Henderson was already reaching for his legal forms. "Rachel will need to sign a disclaimer of inheritance, which will need to be filed with the court within 9 months of your father's death. Once that's done, the business assets will pass directly to Emma as if Rachel had never been named in the will. And the criminal issues? Those will need to be addressed separately. Rachel, I strongly recommend that you consult with a criminal defense attorney immediately. There may be options for plea agreements or restitution arrangements that could help minimize the legal consequences of your actions." As Henderson began preparing the disclaimer paperwork, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that the business would survive, anger at Rachel for putting us in this position in the first place, and a deep sadness that Dad had spent the last months of his life dealing with this betrayal instead of enjoying his retirement plans. But underneath all of those emotions was something else: determination. Dad had been right about my ability to build something better. Walsh Construction would not only survive Rachel's betrayal, it would thrive despite it. And maybe, if I was very lucky, my sister would finally learn the difference between appearing successful and actually earning success. 3 hours later, we walked out of Henderson's office with a completely different understanding of our family's future. Rachel had signed the disclaimer, officially giving up her claim to the Walsh Construction inheritance. I had signed papers accepting the business assets and the responsibilities that came with them. And Mom had agreed to serve as an interim advisor to help me navigate the transition. As we stood on the sidewalk outside Henderson's building, Rachel turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Emma, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know how sorry I am, not just for taking the money, but for putting you and Dad through all of this." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw someone I barely recognized. The confident, glamorous woman who had swept into town for Dad's funeral was gone, replaced by someone who looked smaller, younger, and infinitely more fragile. "Rachel," I said carefully, "I'm not ready to forgive you yet. I may never be ready to forgive you completely, but I am willing to let you try to earn back some trust, one day at a time." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "That's more than I deserve." "Yes," I agreed. "It is." Mom hugged both of us, and for a moment we stood there like a family again. But I knew that the easy, uncomplicated love we had shared before was gone forever. Rachel's choices had changed us all, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. As we walked back to our cars, I thought about the enormous task ahead of me. I would need to conduct a complete audit of the business finances, figure out exactly how much money was missing and where it had gone, and develop a plan for rebuilding our financial stability. I would need to tell our employees what had happened, at least in general terms, and reassure them that their jobs were secure. And I would need to find a way to honor Dad's memory while building a company that could withstand future challenges. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Walking toward my car with the keys to Walsh Construction in my pocket and the weight of 3 generations of family legacy on my shoulders. It wasn't the inheritance I had expected, but it was the inheritance I deserved, and I was going to make the most of it. The hardest part was just beginning, but I was ready for it. Dad had been right about my strength, my integrity, and my ability to build something better, and I was going to prove him right, one honest day's work at a time. The first morning I walked into Walsh Construction as the official owner, I arrived before dawn, just as I had done countless times before. But everything felt different now. The weight of the keys in my hand, the responsibility of 43 employees counting on me, the knowledge that every decision I made would determine whether 3 generations of family legacy survived or crumbled under the weight of Rachel's betrayal. I sat in Dad's office, now my office, surrounded by the familiar smell of coffee and sawdust that had always meant home to me. On the desk in front of me were 3 stacks of documents that would determine the future of everything I cared about. The first stack contained the financial records I had been reviewing for the past 2 weeks, documenting every fraudulent transaction Rachel had made over the past 2 years. The second stack held contracts for upcoming projects, representing nearly $800,000 in committed work that our clients were counting on us to complete. The third stack was the hardest to look at: personnel files for every employee, each one representing a family that depended on Walsh Construction for their livelihood. The audit had taken longer than I expected, but the results were both better and worse than I had feared. Better because Rachel's estimate of $230,000 stolen had been conservative. The actual amount was closer to $280,000. Worse because some of the missing money had been taken from accounts that were specifically designated for employee benefits and tax withholdings, which meant the company now owed money to the IRS and our health insurance provider. I had spent sleepless nights working through different scenarios, trying to find a path forward that wouldn't require laying off employees or defaulting on our existing contracts. The company had assets worth approximately $2 million, including equipment, property, and accounts receivable, but most of those assets were essential to our ongoing operations. Selling off equipment to raise cash would cripple our ability to complete current projects, which would damage our reputation and make it impossible to secure future work. The solution I had developed was aggressive but achievable. I would take out a personal loan using my own credit and the company's assets as collateral, providing immediate cash flow to cover the missing funds and keep operations running smoothly. Then I would implement a strict financial oversight system to prevent future fraud, while aggressively pursuing new contracts to rebuild our cash reserves. It would take approximately 3 years to fully recover from Rachel's theft, assuming we could maintain our current level of business and avoid any major setbacks. The plan was risky, but it was better than the alternatives. And more importantly, it would allow me to keep every single employee on the payroll while we worked our way back to financial stability. I was reviewing the loan documents when I heard the sound of pickup trucks pulling into the parking lot. 6:30 in the morning, exactly on time. Our crew had been arriving at the same time for years, gathering in the break room for coffee and the daily assignments before heading out to job sites across the Portland metro area. I took a deep breath and walked out to meet them. The break room fell quiet when I entered, not because the guys were unfriendly, but because they could sense that something significant was about to happen. Word had gotten around that there had been some kind of family meeting about Dad's will, and everyone was wondering what it meant for their jobs. "Good morning, everyone," I said, looking around the room at faces I had known for years. Some of these men had worked for my grandfather before Dad took over the business. Others had been hired during the expansion years when I was learning the industry. All of them had families, mortgages, and responsibilities that depended on the stability of Walsh Construction. "As you all know, we've been working through some administrative issues related to Dad's estate," I continued. "I wanted to let you know that as of yesterday, I am officially the owner and president of Walsh Construction." There were nods and a few quiet expressions of congratulations, but I could see the questions in their eyes. They wanted to know what changes were coming, whether their jobs were secure, and how Dad's death would affect the day-to-day operations they had grown accustomed to. "I also want to be honest with you about some challenges we're facing," I said. "During the transition process, we discovered some financial irregularities that have affected the company's cash flow. Nothing that threatens the long-term viability of the business, but something we need to address systematically over the next few years." Tom Martinez, our senior foreman who had been with the company for 15 years, raised his hand. "Emma, are you talking about layoffs?" "No," I said firmly. "I'm talking about the opposite. We're going to work harder and smarter than we ever have before. We're going to pursue new contracts, expand our capabilities, and build this company into something even stronger than it was before. But it's going to require commitment from all of us." I spent the next 20 minutes outlining my plans for the company's future. We would be implementing new project management software to improve efficiency and reduce waste. We would be pursuing larger commercial contracts that offered better profit margins than our traditional residential work. And we would be establishing a profit-sharing program that would give every employee a direct stake in the company's success. The response was better than I had hoped. These guys had worked with me for years, and they knew I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. By the time the meeting ended, there was a sense of excitement in the room that reminded me why I had fallen in love with this business in the first place. As the crews headed out to their job sites, I returned to my office to make the phone calls that would determine whether my optimistic projections were realistic or just wishful thinking. The first call was to Marcus Chen, the loan officer at Pacific Northwest Bank, who had handled our business accounts for the past 5 years. Marcus had known Dad well and had always been supportive of our expansion plans. I was hoping that personal relationship would help when I explained our current situation. "Emma, I was sorry to hear about your father," Marcus said when I reached him. "He was a good man and a valued client. How can I help you today?" I explained the situation as diplomatically as possible, focusing on the embezzlement as an isolated incident that we had identified and addressed, rather than a systemic problem with the company's financial management. I outlined my repayment plan and the collateral I was prepared to offer, emphasizing the company's strong track record and solid reputation in the Portland construction market. Marcus was quiet for a long moment after I finished speaking. "Emma, I appreciate your honesty about this situation. Most business owners would try to hide something like this rather than addressing it head-on. But I have to tell you, a personal loan for $280,000 is outside my normal approval authority." My heart sank, but Marcus continued before I could respond. "However, based on your family's history with our bank and the strength of your business model, I think I can get approval for a secured business line of credit. It would require a personal guarantee from you, and we'd need to put a lien on your business assets, but the interest rate would be lower than a personal loan, and you'd only pay interest on the funds you actually use." It was better than I had hoped for. A line of credit would give me flexibility to draw funds as needed, rather than taking a lump sum loan with immediate interest obligations. And the lower interest rate would save thousands of dollars over the repayment period. What's the timeline for approval? I asked. If you can get me all the documentation by Friday, I should have an answer for you by the middle of next week. I spent the rest of the morning gathering financial statements, tax returns, and asset valuations that Marcus would need for the loan application. It was tedious work, but it gave me a chance to really understand the company's financial position in detail. Despite Rachel's theft, Walsh Construction was fundamentally sound. We had strong relationships with suppliers, a trust-us-a-Larry excellent reputation with clients, and a backlog of work that would keep us busy for the next 6 months. The second call I needed to make was more difficult. David Kim was our largest client, a property developer who had given us contracts worth over $300,000 in the past year alone. David valued reliability above all else, and I knew that any hint of financial instability could cost us future work. "Emma, congratulations on taking over the business," David said when I called. "Your father spoke very highly of your capabilities. I'm looking forward to working with you going forward." "Thank you, David. I'm calling because I wanted to discuss our current projects and make sure you're completely satisfied with our progress." We spent several minutes reviewing the timeline for a commercial renovation project we were completing for one of his properties. Everything was on schedule and under budget, which gave me the opening I needed to bring up larger issues. "David, I also wanted to let you know that we're actively pursuing larger commercial contracts. Walsh Construction has the capability and experience to handle projects significantly larger than what we've done for you in the past, and I'm wondering if you might have opportunities that would be a good fit for our expanded capacity." David was interested. He had been frustrated with some of the larger contractors he had worked with, citing poor communication and cost overruns that had eaten into his profit margins. Walsh Construction's reputation for reliability and attention to detail was exactly what he was looking for in a primary contractor. "Actually, Emma, I have a mixed-use development project coming up that might be perfect for you. It's a 12-unit residential building with ground-floor commercial space, total construction value around $2.8 million. Would Walsh Construction be interested in bidding on something that size?" I tried to keep the excitement out of my voice. A $2.8 million contract would be the largest project in the company's history, and the profit margin on a job that size could single-handedly solve our financial problems. "We would definitely be interested," I said. "When do you need the bid?" "I'm still working through the permitting process, but I should have final plans ready in about 6 weeks. If you're serious about this, I can send you the preliminary drawings so you can start working on cost estimates." After hanging up with David, I sat back in my chair and allowed myself a moment of cautious optimism. If I could secure the line of credit from the bank and win the contract with David's development project, Walsh Construction would not only survive Rachel's betrayal, but emerge stronger than ever. The third call was the one I had been dreading most. Rachel had been staying at Mom's house since the will reading, supposedly looking for work and preparing to move back to Portland permanently. But according to Mom, she had been spending most of her time sleeping late and feeling sorry for herself rather than taking concrete steps to address the consequences of her actions. "Hi, Emma," Rachel answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep even though it was nearly noon. "Rachel, we need to talk. Can you meet me at the office this afternoon?" "I guess so. Is everything okay?" "Everything is going to be okay, but only if we handle this situation properly. I need you here at 2 o'clock. Rachel arrived 20 minutes late, looking like she had thrown on clothes without much thought and forgotten to brush her hair. The contrast between this version of my sister and the polished, confident woman who had swept into town for Dad's funeral was jarring. It was like watching someone deflate in slow motion. "You look terrible," I said without preamble. "Thanks a lot," she replied, slumping into the chair across from my desk. "I feel terrible too, if that makes you feel better." "It doesn't make me feel better, Rachel. It makes me worried that you're going to fall apart completely, instead of dealing with your problems like an adult." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "What do you want me to say, Emma? I destroyed everything. I ruined Dad's legacy, I nearly destroyed the family business, and I cost you your inheritance. I'm a terrible person, and everyone would be better off if I just disappeared." "Stop it," I said sharply. Feeling sorry for yourself is not going to fix anything. And running away again is exactly the kind of thinking that got you into this mess in the first place. I pulled out a folder I had prepared and set it on the desk between us. This is a repayment plan, I said, based on the actual amount you stole, which was $280,000, not the $230,000 you estimated. If you get a job that pays $30,000 a year and commit to living on $20,000, you can pay back the full amount in 28 years. Rachel stared at the numbers I had calculated. 28 years. 28 years, I confirmed. That's assuming you can find steady work and stick to a strict budget. If you get a better job or live even more frugally, you can pay it back faster. Emma, I can't live on $20,000 a year. Rachel, you stole almost $300,000 to fund a lifestyle you couldn't afford. You're going to live on $20,000 a year because that's what people who make $30,000 a year actually live on. Millions of people do it every day. I opened the folder and showed her the detailed budget I had worked out. Rent for a studio apartment, $400 a month. Groceries, $200 a month. Transportation, $100 a month. Phone, $50 a month. Everything else is luxury that you'll have to earn through better employment or side income. Rachel was quiet for a long time, studying the numbers with an expression I couldn't read. What kind of job am I supposed to get? She asked finally. Any job, I said. You have a college degree and work experience. Start with retail, food service, administrative work, whatever you can find immediately. Then work your way up. The goal is not to have the job you want right away. The goal is to have a job that pays you enough to start making restitution. And after 28 years? After 28 years, you'll have paid back every penny you stole, and you'll have built a real life based on honest work instead of pretending to be someone you're not. You'll be 57 years old, and you'll still have time to build genuine success instead of fake success. Rachel was crying again, but this time it seemed different. Less self-pity and more genuine recognition of the enormity of what she had done, and what it would take to make it right. Emma, do you really think I can do this? I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and tried to see past the mistakes and the selfishness to whatever core of decency might still exist underneath. I think you can do this if you want to do this, I said, but it has to be a real commitment, not just something you agree to today and give up on when it gets hard. I want to try, she said quietly. I really want to try. Then here's what happens next. You're going to get a job within 2 weeks, any job. I don't care if it's washing dishes or stocking shelves, but you're going to be employed and earning money by the end of this month. You're going to find your own apartment, not something mom pays for or subsidizes. And you're going to make your first restitution payment of $833 by the end of next month. Rachel nodded, writing down the details in a notebook she had pulled from her purse. And Rachel, I added, if you disappear again, if you decide this is too hard and run back to New York or anywhere else, I will have Henderson file criminal charges immediately. This is your one chance to make this right without going to prison. I understand, she said. I won't run away again. As Rachel left the office, I felt emotionally drained but cautiously hopeful. My sister had a long, difficult road ahead of her, but for the first time since this whole crisis began, she seemed to understand the seriousness of her situation and the commitment it would take to recover from it. I turned my attention back to the loan application documents, working late into the evening to ensure that every detail was perfect. The future of Walsh Construction and the livelihoods of everyone who depended on it hung in the balance of decisions that would be made in bank boardrooms and client offices over the next few weeks. But as I worked, I felt a growing sense of confidence that we would not just survive this crisis, but emerge from it stronger and more resilient than ever. Rachel's betrayal had nearly destroyed us, but it had also forced me to think more strategically about the business than I ever had before. The expansion plans I was developing, the new systems I was implementing, and the deeper client relationships I was building would serve Walsh Construction well for years to come. Dad had been right about my ability to build something better, and I was finally getting the chance to prove it. 6 weeks after Rachel's confession, I was standing in the conference room of Kim Development Group, surrounded by architectural drawings that represented the most important opportunity in Walsh Construction's 70-year history. The $2.8 million mixed-use development project was spread across the table in front of me like a puzzle I had spent countless hours learning to solve. Every measurement, every specification, every material requirement had been analyzed and reanalyzed to ensure that my bid would be both competitive and profitable. David Kim sat across from me with his project manager Sarah Chen and his financial advisor Michael Torres. This wasn't just a presentation about construction capabilities. It was an audition for the future of my company. If I won this contract, Walsh Construction would have the financial stability to weather Rachel's theft and emerge stronger than ever. If I lost it, we would spend the next 3 years barely staying afloat while competitors gained ground in markets we had once dominated. "Emma, we've reviewed your preliminary estimates," David said, adjusting his glasses as he studied the bound proposal I had prepared. "Your numbers are competitive with the other bids we've received, but what sets your proposal apart is the level of detail and the timeline you've outlined." I had spent sleepless nights perfecting that proposal, consulting with specialists on everything from foundation requirements to energy-efficient building systems. The timeline I had developed was aggressive but achievable, promising completion 4 weeks ahead of the schedule proposed by our largest competitor. The timeline is based on our ability to overlap certain phases of construction that are typically done sequentially, I explained, pointing to the detailed Gantt chart I had included in the proposal. Our crew has experience with this type of coordination, and we've identified potential bottlenecks early enough to develop contingency plans. Sarah Chen leaned forward, clearly impressed by the thoroughness of my planning. "What about weather delays? Portland's rainy season can significantly impact exterior work. We've factored in a 15% buffer for weather-related delays, and we're prepared to use covered work areas for critical exterior components during the worst of the winter months. Additionally, we can accelerate interior work during periods when exterior work is impossible." For the next hour, we walked through every aspect of the project, from the specialized foundation work required for the commercial space to the sustainable building materials I had sourced for the residential units. David asked pointed questions about cost overruns, change orders, and quality control measures, and I had prepared answers for all of them. The most difficult moment came when Michael Torres asked about Walsh Construction's financial stability. "Emma, we've heard rumors about some family complications related to your father's estate," he said carefully. "Can you assure us that Walsh Construction has the financial resources to complete a project of this magnitude?" I had anticipated this question and prepared for it extensively. Rather than being defensive or evasive, I decided to address it directly. "You're referring to some financial irregularities we discovered during the estate transition," I said. "I want to be completely transparent about this because I believe honesty is the foundation of any successful business relationship." I explained how we had identified and addressed the embezzlement, emphasizing the systems I had implemented to prevent future fraud and the financial backing I had secured to ensure the company's stability. I provided letters of reference from our bank, our bonding company, and 3 major clients who had worked with us during the transition period. "The situation you're referring to was resolved 6 weeks ago," I concluded. "Walsh Construction is now financially stronger and more carefully managed than it has ever been in its history." David exchanged glances with his team, and I could see them weighing the risk of working with a company that had recently experienced internal theft against the advantages of our competitive bid and proven track record. "Emma, we're going to need some time to discuss this," David said finally. "Can you give us until Friday to make our final decision?" It was Tuesday. 3 days of waiting to learn whether my company would survive and thrive or struggle for years to come. I shook hands with each member of David's team and walked out of their office building with my stomach in knots. The next 3 days were the longest of my professional life. I threw myself into other projects, trying to stay busy enough to avoid constantly checking my phone for calls from David's office. We had 2 smaller residential projects nearing completion, and I spent hours on site with our crews, double-checking every detail to ensure that our work quality remained impeccable regardless of the stress I was feeling. On Thursday afternoon, I received a call that I had been dreading since the day Rachel confessed her crimes. "Ms. Walsh, this is Detective Jennifer Rodriguez with the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit. I need to schedule an interview with you regarding some irregularities in your business accounts that were reported to our department. My hand started shaking before she finished speaking. Someone had reported Rachel's embezzlement to the police, which meant the criminal investigation I had been hoping to avoid was now inevitable. Detective Rodriguez, can you tell me who made this report? I'm not able to discuss that information over the phone, but I can tell you that we've received documentation suggesting that significant fraudulent activity occurred at Walsh Construction over the past 2 years. I need to interview you as the current business owner to understand the scope of the activity and your knowledge of it. I scheduled the interview for the following Monday, giving myself the weekend to consult with a criminal defense attorney and prepare for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. The timing couldn't have been worse, with David's decision still pending and the future of my company hanging in the balance. Friday morning arrived with a phone call that came at exactly 9 o'clock. Emma, this is David Kim. Do you have a few minutes to talk? My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it through the phone. Of course, David, what can I do for you? We've made our decision about the development project. We'd like to move forward with Walsh Construction as our primary contractor. The relief was so overwhelming that I had to sit down. We had won the contract, the largest project in our company's history, the financial lifeline that would ensure our survival and future growth. David, that's fantastic news. I want to assure you that you've made the right choice, and Walsh Construction will exceed your expectations on this project. I believe you will, Emma. Your presentation was impressive, but what really convinced us was the way you handled the questions about your company's recent challenges. That kind of transparency and accountability is rare in this industry. We spent the next 30 minutes discussing contract details, project timelines, and the legal documentation that would need to be completed before work could begin. By the time I hung up the phone, I felt like a completely different person than the woman who had walked into Henderson's office 6 weeks earlier to hear my father's will. The celebration was short-lived, however, because I still had to deal with the police investigation that could potentially destroy everything I had just accomplished. I spent Friday afternoon meeting with Janet Morrison, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crime. Janet was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who had built her reputation defending business owners and executives accused of financial crimes. Emma, based on what you've told me, you're in a difficult position, Janet said after I explained the situation with Rachel's embezzlement. You're not criminally liable for crimes you didn't commit, but you could face civil liability as the business owner, and there's always a risk that the prosecutor might try to argue that you were complicit in the fraud. But I had no knowledge of what Rachel was doing, I protested. I only found out about it when Henderson discovered the forged documents. I believe you, and I think we can demonstrate your lack of knowledge convincingly. But the fact remains that the fraud occurred under your nose for 2 years, using your signature and your access to the accounts. A prosecutor might argue that you should have known what was happening. Janet explained the legal strategy we would use if charges were filed against me. We would emphasize my cooperation with the investigation, my immediate steps to address the financial damage, and the testimony of employees and clients who could attest to my character and integrity. The most important thing is that you continue to be completely honest and cooperative with the police, she said. Don't volunteer information they don't ask for, but don't lie or try to hide anything either. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and drizzling rain that matched my mood perfectly. I met Janet at the police station downtown, where Detective Rodriguez had arranged to conduct our interview in a small conference room that smelled like stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. Detective Rodriguez was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of my appearance and demeanor. She was accompanied by Detective William Hayes, an older man who took notes while Rodriguez asked questions. Ms. Walsh, I want to start by thanking you for coming in voluntarily, Rodriguez began. We're investigating allegations of embezzlement and fraud at Walsh Construction, and we need to understand your role in the company's financial operations. For the next 2 hours, I answered questions about everything from my daily responsibilities at Walsh Construction, to my relationship with Rachel, to my knowledge of the company's banking procedures. Rodriguez was thorough but fair, and I could tell that she was trying to distinguish between victims and perpetrators rather than assuming everyone involved was guilty. The most difficult part came when she asked me directly about my knowledge of Rachel's activities. Ms. Walsh, Your sister was able to forge your signature and access company accounts for over 2 years. How is it possible that you never noticed any irregularities in the financial records? I had prepared for this question, but it was still painful to answer honestly. Detective Rodriguez, I trusted my father completely, and he trusted Rachel completely. When she was at the office, I assumed she was there legitimately. When money was transferred between accounts, I assumed Dad had authorized it. I was focused on project management and client relationships, not on monitoring every financial transaction. But didn't you review bank statements or financial reports that would have shown these unauthorized transfers? Dad handled all the major financial oversight himself. My responsibilities were operational, not financial. I realize now that this was a mistake, and I've implemented new systems to ensure that no one person has unchecked access to company funds. Rodriguez nodded, making notes in her file. Ms. Walsh, we've spoken with your sister Rachel, and she has admitted to the embezzlement. She's agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation, in exchange for consideration during sentencing. So Rachel had already confessed to the police. That explained how they had learned about the embezzlement, and it meant that the criminal case would proceed regardless of my cooperation. What happens next? I asked. We'll complete our investigation over the next few weeks, Rodriguez explained. Based on the evidence and Rachel's cooperation, it's likely that charges will be filed against her for embezzlement, fraud, and forgery. As for you, we haven't found any evidence that you were aware of or participated in her criminal activity. The relief I felt was almost overwhelming. While Rachel would face serious criminal charges, I would be able to move forward with rebuilding Walsh Construction without the cloud of potential prosecution hanging over me. As Janet and I left the police station, I felt like I was finally emerging from the nightmare that had begun with Dad's death and the reading of his will. Rachel would face the consequences of her actions, but Walsh Construction would survive and thrive. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as I prepared to begin work on David's development project. I hired 3 additional crew members to handle the increased workload, purchased specialized equipment that would be needed for the commercial construction components, and established relationships with new suppliers who could provide the high-quality materials the project demanded. Rachel found a job at a local grocery store, earning $11 an hour stocking shelves and working checkout during busy periods. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and she seemed to be taking it seriously. She had also found a studio apartment in a less expensive part of town and had made her first restitution payment of $833 exactly on schedule. Mom was slowly adjusting to life without Dad and to the new reality of our family dynamics. She had initially been devastated by Rachel's confession, but she was gradually coming to terms with the situation and focusing on supporting both of her daughters as we worked through the consequences of Rachel's choices. The most satisfying moment came on a Wednesday morning in late September when I stood on the construction site of David's development project, watching our crew break ground on the foundation. The sun was shining for the first time in weeks, and the sound of heavy machinery mixed with the voices of workers who were excited to be part of the largest project in the company's history. Tom Martinez walked over to where I was standing, a broad smile on his weathered face. "Emma, this is something special," he said, gesturing toward the bustling construction site. "Your dad would be proud of what you've built here." I thought about Dad's letter, about his faith in my ability to build something better than what had come before. Standing there watching Walsh Construction tackle its most ambitious project ever, with a crew of skilled workers who trusted my leadership and clients who respected our reputation for quality and integrity, I finally understood what he had meant. Rachel's betrayal had nearly destroyed us, but it had also forced me to become a stronger leader and a more strategic business owner than I might have become otherwise. The systems I had implemented, the relationships I had built, and the financial discipline I had learned would serve Walsh Construction well for decades to come. As I watched the first concrete being poured for the foundation of David's building, I realized that Dad had been right about more than just my business capabilities. He had been right about the importance of protecting what matters most, even when the cost is higher than anyone wants to pay. Rachel was facing criminal charges and years of financial hardship, but she was also getting the chance to build a real life based on honest work, instead of fake success built on stolen money. Mom was learning to live independently after 35 years of marriage, but she was also discovering strengths she never knew she had. And I was no longer just the daughter who worked at the family business. I was the owner and president of Walsh Construction, responsible for carrying on 3 generations of legacy while building something new and better for the future. The foundation work continued throughout the day, and by evening we had made significant progress toward the first major milestone of the project. As I locked up the construction trailer and headed home, I felt a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment that had been missing from my life for months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new opportunities to prove that Walsh Construction deserved the trust our clients placed in us. But tonight, I could finally rest, knowing that we had not just survived the crisis Rachel had created, but emerged from it stronger and more resilient than ever. Dad's faith in my abilities had been justified, and his sacrifice to protect me from the legal consequences of Rachel's crimes had given me the foundation I needed to build something truly extraordinary. The future of Walsh Construction was bright, and I was ready to lead us toward it with confidence, integrity, and the kind of determination that had made the Walsh name synonymous with quality for 7 decades. 1 year later, I stood in the same oak-paneled conference room where my world had been turned upside down, but this time the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Henderson sat at the head of the table with a stack of legal documents that represented triumph rather than betrayal, and Mom sat beside me with a smile that reminded me of happier times before grief and scandal had complicated our lives. The mixed-use development project had been completed 3 weeks ahead of schedule and $15,000 under budget. David Kim had been so impressed with our work that he had already signed us for 2 additional projects worth a combined $2 million. Walsh Construction was no longer just surviving Rachel's theft. We were thriving beyond anything I had imagined possible. "Emma, I have some documents here that I think will interest you," Henderson said, opening the folder in front of him. First, the final settlement agreement for the restitution payments. Rachel had surprised everyone, myself included, by not only keeping her job at the grocery store but earning 2 promotions over the past year. She was now an assistant manager making $16 an hour, and she had taken on additional work doing bookkeeping for small businesses in the evenings. Her monthly restitution payments had increased from $833 to $1,200, which meant she would be able to pay back the full amount in 18 years instead of the original 28. More importantly, she had stuck to the strict budget we had agreed upon, living in her small studio apartment and avoiding the temptation to return to the lifestyle that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. Every month, she delivered her restitution check to my office personally, and every month she looked a little more like the sister I remembered from our childhood before success and failure had driven us apart. "The second document," Henderson continued, "is something I think your father would have been very proud to see." He handed me a legal filing that took me a moment to understand. It was an application to trademark the name Walsh Construction and Development, along with paperwork to officially expand our business license to include commercial development services. "Emma, based on your success with the Kim projects and the inquiries you've been receiving from other developers, I think it's time to make this expansion official." Over the past year, word had spread throughout Portland's development community about the quality of our work and the reliability of our project management. We had received calls from developers in Seattle, Spokane, and even San Francisco, asking if Walsh Construction would be willing to take on projects outside our traditional service area. The little construction company that Grandpa had started with a pickup truck and a toolbox was evolving into something much larger and more sophisticated, but it was happening organically, based on earned reputation rather than borrowed money or stolen funds. "There's one more thing," Henderson said, reaching for a final document. This arrived by certified mail yesterday. The envelope was addressed to me personally, with a return address I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from the Oregon State Contractors Board, informing me that Walsh Construction had been selected for their annual Excellence in Construction Award, recognizing outstanding achievement in project management, client satisfaction, and community service. The award came with a cash prize of $5,000 and recognition at a ceremony that would be attended by contractors, developers, and government officials from across the Pacific Northwest. More importantly, it was validation that everything I had worked to rebuild over the past year was being noticed and respected by the industry I had devoted my career to serving. "Emma, there's something I need to tell you," Mom said quietly. "Something I should have told you months ago." I looked at her with concern, worried that there might be another family secret I wasn't prepared to handle. "Your father knew," she said simply, "about Rachel's problems with money, about her lifestyle in New York that didn't match her income. He didn't know about the embezzlement specifically, but he knew she was struggling financially and making poor decisions." Henderson nodded confirmingly. "Your mother is right, Emma. Your father came to see me about 6 months before he died, asking about legal ways to help Rachel without enabling her destructive behavior. He was trying to find a solution that would teach her responsibility while protecting you from the consequences of her choices. The will change wasn't just about protecting me from legal liability," I said, understanding dawning slowly. "It was about forcing Rachel to face the consequences of her actions while giving me the opportunity to prove what I could build on my own. Your father believed that you were strong enough to overcome any challenge, including losing the inheritance you had expected," Mom explained. "But he also believed that Rachel needed to hit rock bottom before she could learn to climb back up honestly." I thought about the Rachel I had seen that morning when she delivered her restitution payment. She looked tired from working 2 jobs, but she also looked healthier than she had in years. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there during her New York days. A sense of pride and honest accomplishment that no amount of stolen money could have purchased. "He was right," I said. "About both of us." Henderson gathered the documents and prepared to file the business expansion paperwork that would officially launch the next phase of Walsh Construction's evolution. As we left his office, I felt the same sense of completion that I had experienced on the day we finished David's development project. The crisis that had begun with Dad's death and the shocking will reading had tested every assumption I had about family, fairness, and forgiveness. But it had also revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed, and opened opportunities I had never imagined possible. Rachel met us for lunch at a small cafe near her apartment, arriving directly from her morning shift at the grocery store. She looked nothing like the glamorous woman who had once swept into Portland wearing designer clothes bought with stolen money, but she looked like someone I could respect and possibly, eventually, forgive completely. "Emma, I heard about the contractor's award," she said as we sat down. "I'm really proud of what you've accomplished." "Thank you," I said. "And I'm proud of what you've accomplished too. 18 months ago, I wasn't sure you had it in you to work an honest job and stick to a budget." 18 months ago, I wasn't sure either, she admitted. But it turns out that earning something feels a lot better than stealing it, even when it takes longer and the apartment is smaller. We spent lunch talking about practical things, Rachel's work schedule, Mom's plans to travel now that she was feeling ready to see the world again, and my timeline for expanding Walsh Construction into commercial development. It was the kind of normal family conversation that had seemed impossible during the dark months following Dad's death. As we prepared to leave, Rachel handed me an envelope that contained her monthly restitution payment plus an additional $300. "I got a bonus for excellent customer service ratings," she explained. "I wanted to put it toward paying back what I owe." It was a small gesture in the context of the nearly $300,000 she had stolen, but it represented something much larger, a genuine commitment to making things right regardless of how long it took or how difficult it became. Walking back to my office that afternoon, I thought about the letter Dad had written to explain his decision about the inheritance. He had been right about my strength, my integrity, and my ability to build something better than what had come before. But more than that, he had been right about the importance of protecting the people you love, even when the cost is higher than anyone wants to pay. The Walsh Construction sign above our office door had been repainted the month before, with "and development" added underneath in letters that matched the original design. Our crew had grown to 22 employees, and we were interviewing candidates for 3 additional positions. The company Grandpa had started in 1952 was entering its 8th decade stronger and more respected than ever. But the most important change wasn't visible on any sign or business document. It was the knowledge that our family had survived its greatest crisis and emerged with a deeper understanding of what really mattered: honest work, earned success, and the kind of forgiveness that has to be built slowly through consistent action, rather than granted quickly through emotional appeals. That evening, I sat in Dad's office, now permanently my office, reviewing plans for our next major project. The financial statements spread across my desk showed a company that was not just profitable, but positioned for sustainable growth over the coming decades. The systems I had implemented to prevent future fraud were working perfectly, and the relationships I had built with clients and suppliers were stronger than ever. Rachel's crime had nearly destroyed everything our family had built over 3 generations. But in forcing me to fight for Walsh Construction's survival, it had also taught me lessons about leadership, resilience, and strategic thinking that I never would have learned otherwise. I pulled out the letter Dad had written to me and read it one more time, focusing on the final paragraph. I believe you have the strength and ability to build something even better on your own. I am changing my will not because I love you less, but because I love you enough to protect you from paying for someone else's mistakes. He had been right about everything. Rachel was paying for her own mistakes, slowly but steadily. Walsh Construction was not just surviving but thriving under my leadership. And our family was healing from wounds that had once seemed too deep to repair. As I locked up the office and headed home, I felt grateful for the crisis that had seemed like the end of everything but had actually been the beginning of something better. Dad's final gift to me hadn't been the inheritance I expected, but the opportunity to prove what I was capable of building on my own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, and new opportunities to carry the Walsh name forward with honor. And I was ready for all of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.